It's great to see you all this afternoon for our second Libraries Transforming Communities distance learning session on theming and using public knowledge. This webinar should be a particularly valuable follow-up as a follow-up to our last learning session on hosting community conversations and to inform the community conversations that so many of you and your colleagues have been hosting within your communities. I would be remiss at this point if I did not say that Libraries Transforming Communities is an initiative of the American Library Association made possible through a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. ALA has partnered with the Harwood Institute for Public Innovation on this important and wide-ranging initiative based on their approach of turning outward to effect community change. Before we get started, I have a couple of technical reminders that I believe Brian has already posted in chat, but I'll just go over for those of you who are just logging on now. If you experience technical difficulties at any point during the session, please send a private message to our technical support, Brian Russell, describing your problem. To send a private message, hover over Brian's name at the top of the attendees list and select Start Private Chat. Also, please note this session is being recorded and the archive will be made available in Connect. Please, throughout this session, post your questions as we go in the chat box. Our presenters will call those questions as we go, and we'll be sure to answer all questions by the end of the webinar. And I'd like to also remind you that the webinar PowerPoint and the audio, as well as everything in the chat, are part of the recording. And we'll send you all a link to the archive as soon as it's available, and the archive will also be made accessible via the Libraries Transforming Communities project website, and you can share it with your colleagues, peers, and others interested in this work. I think we have representation from every library in the cohort, which is so exciting. It's so great to see you all again. I'll say it again. So the learning tool for today's webinar is the Theming and Using Public Knowledge Workbook up there on the screen. If you don't already have it in hand, you may download it by using the link on this slide. It probably won't hot link for you, but you can just paste it into your web browser. Please do that in a new view page so that you don't get disconnected from the webinar as we go along. So this is the tool that today's webinar will use, and you can look for corresponding page references at the bottom left-hand corner of many of the slides throughout today. So now I'm going to hand it off to our two wonderful presenters and Harwood certified coaches, Jen Elliott and Carlton Sears. And I guess I'll just say, I'll turn over the mic and say, take it away. I believe Carlton kicks off. Thank you.
Right. So can everybody hear me okay? Maybe a couple people just type in yes, so I'm confident of that. And I've got a yes already, so that's great. Like Mary said, it's great that you're all here, and I'm glad to connect with you again. And I know some of you have been doing conversations because I've heard from you. And this is going to focus on basically what to do with everything you've been hearing. But before we get started, just a quick reminder about this is about turning outward. And turning outward is about our orientation to the community and our behaviors. And the gist of this is you have to be intentional, as you know, to turn outward. And that means making choices and judgments. And hosting the community conversations that you've been doing demonstrates your commitment to turning outward. We're going to be doing page references through the webinar. In the lower left-hand corner, the page references are to the workbook that Mary just mentioned. All of the slides don't have page references, but many of them do. Just another quick refresher. The conversations are about public knowledge, and in most communities, few organizations or leaders have public knowledge, and too often we rely only on expert advice to inform our decision-making, with the results being that we often develop strategies and actions that our communities don't really mobilize around because they don't reflect what people really care about. And this slide is also a reminder that you've seen before, just the difference between public knowledge and expert knowledge, and that you really need both to be able to develop strategies. So what we're going to cover in this session, we're going to talk about how you can organize what you are hearing in these conversations so that you can make sense of it all. We'll talk about turning the themes that come out of these conversations into stories that will resonate with your community. As we've said before, public knowledge belongs to the community. We know that sharing what you have heard makes gives a sense of energy to shared possibilities that people have. And we'll talk about strategies for sharing public knowledge, for being good stewards of public knowledge that you've gained. And we're also going to talk about the sharing of public knowledge, how that allows people in the community to see the library in a different light. And because it is because the library is gaining a knowledge of the community that most other organizations don't have. And as others see the library in a new light, we can start to see ourselves, our libraries, differently as well, which leads to new possibilities. And then finally, we're going to be pausing as we go through, as we did last time, after each of these sections so people can ask questions. So now on with the main portion of the slide set. The first section here on generating public knowledge. Remember, the goal is to get at what is shared among community members. The shared aspirations, the shared sense of what actions would get a community on a good path. You're trying to get out a multiple conversation, that shared sense that people have. You can't do that with a single conversation, which is why in the last webinar we said it's best to start with 3 to learn how to do the conversations, and 4 or 5 more to gain a really good sense of the general public knowledge of the community. From this point, you can go further, but the strategy of how you go further really depends on the community engagement focus that you're going to be having. You need enough material to find high-level patterns that will resonate, whether we're for people that were in the conversations. So you might think about, do you have enough conversations under your belt that you can start asking that authority test of yourself? Could I stand on the table and talk to people about their community, their aspirations, their concerns, and would they believe me? So through this process, you're going to be moving from a lot of very detailed notes toward lessons learned that you can use to make decisions and inform your work. We recommend that the facilitator and the note taker take a few minutes right after each conversation and ask themselves questions like, what did you make of this conversation? What really resonated for you? Where was the energy of the group? Any quotes that really stuck out with you that people said? Doing that right after you have the conversation is a good thing to do, because one thing you'll find as you move away from the conversation, say days pass or a week pass, the memory of that and the vibrancy of it, you tend to lose that with time. Within a few days, the note taker should organize the notes from the conversation into 6 main categories listed on this slide. This is an important step, because if the notes are clear, then it is easier to compare what you heard across multiple conversations. And we have posted, if you haven't seen it yet, on the ALA Connect site for this group, a set of sample notes that came from some actual conversations. So you can get a look at what the notes actually look like. So you'll have organized each of the conversations, each individual conversation you'll have organized into these 6 categories that are on the previous screen. In this step, you're combining the notes within each of these categories. So for example, you will look at the aspirations category across all the conversations and put them together. You're not really trying to synthesize at this stage. Often people skip this stage. However, it is really hard to move from raw notes to compare and contrast across conversations if you don't do this step. This is really more a task for a single person to do the integration as opposed to a large group to do the integration. At this stage, it's like, say, for example, you've had 6 conversations, you've put them into into those 6 categories, and what you're really doing is a person is sitting down and putting together aspirations from all 6 so that you see them together. You're going to put together main concerns from all 6 so you can see them together. specific issue concerns from all 6 so you can see them together. And this, in essence, is how you go about organizing your notes so you can get ready for the next stage, which is identifying themes and developing a story. So I'm going to pause at this point and just see if there's any questions that people have about organizing the notes. So I'm not seeing any, so I'm just going to go right on. And if some occur to you later, we can pause and try to respond to those. So the next piece on identifying themes from all these notes, here you're moving from the general groupings that you've made into making sense of what you have, identifying themes and creating stories around the way people really are seeing their community. It's not enough to develop the categories. Now is the point where you're trying to synthesize and to combine the themes that you have identified in each category.
Carlton?
Yes.
There's a question from Erica. Should we use the information from the ask and aspirations exercise?
You can use the information from the ask and aspirations exercise. All of those are collecting different levels of public information. You're going to be collecting at that point certainly people's aspirations for a community, some of the challenges they face, some of the things they think would make a difference. So yes, you can use that in this category. You can categorize those pieces of information as well. Well, let me go on with identifying themes, and I'll pause again at the end of this step to answer questions. But at this stage, you want to meet with those on the staff or your partners who have been part of holding these conversations. This works best with a group no larger than 6 to 8. Make sure that the facilitator and note taker are part of this conversation. And this stage of it is what you're trying to do is, this is around innovation and learning and staying open as you're trying out to learn different themes. You're trying to distill the meaning of what you've heard at this point. It's not about adding up quantities. For example, I heard this 6 times and I only heard this 2 times, so we're only going to focus on the thing we heard 6. What you're trying to get at here is more at the meaning of what people are trying to say. Think about this kind of like the 80-20 rule. Start with what you agree on first, or otherwise you're going to go down a rabbit hole debating language and not really getting at meaning. The part of this is where people can initially start out and say, well, what do we all see? What can we agree with? Start at that point. Keep in mind that the goal is to act on what you have heard that matters to the community. So to do this, you need to be able to move from the hundreds of details in these conversations to a clear, sufficiently detailed story that resonates with diverse community members. Remember that to take action, you need to be confident that your actions are grounded in what the community is telling you matters. So this begins with having the themes from which you can create a story. So you start the meeting by asking some warm-up questions. What did you take from the conversations, for example, would be a good warm-up question. Just what did you make of it? After people get warmed up and start having some conversation on that, start theming within a category. And remember, start with where people can agree. And use these 4 questions against each category to guide the conversation. So you're going to start with aspirations, and you're going to ask, looking at the groupings, what do you see? What are people trying to say? What are they trying to tell us? How do the ideas and concepts fit together? Then move down each one of the 6 categories and stick to the order of these questions and stick to the order of the categories and just keep going through them. You're really not aggregating. You're not counting up the number of bullets, but you're really rather trying to look to make sense of it and gather meaning. Remember, you're looking to move toward themes that you can use to help inform your work moving forward. So to give you an example of what this looks like, we've developed a slide here that actually has some bullet points from some theming conversations. And I want to give you a moment at this point just to read through those bullets so we can see what we've got there. And we're going to use this one as an example. So I'll pause and let you just read through this. So as you go down these and you think about some of the points in here, you'll note that there are certain ideas that come out repeatedly. These ideas in these 5 bullets, for example, are really about finding ways to give back to the community and improve ourselves. That's one way that you could think about the theme coming through there. Here's another set of bullets that seem to be saying maybe something else. Create a safer and friendly community. That those two things go hand in hand. And here's another theme that might emerge from looking at these bullet points. Make more opportunities available to people, jobs, information, and attractions. Again, you may end up playing around with the language of the themes, but the idea here is that you're going down, looking through the bullets, and you're trying to make sense of what people are trying to tell you. It doesn't need to be in that exact language that you have in those bullets, but you're trying to make it reflect what is heard in there. So I want to pause again at this point before going on and see if there's any questions here. And again, this will probably be more helpful as you go back and look at this webinar because you can take more time on this particular slide example. And I would suggest that on our next call with Jan and I, you take a little bit more time to look at this and we can spend some time talking about it. But are there any questions while I pause right here? No questions? Okay, at this point, I'm going to pass it over to Jan, and she's going to start with identifying themes and this moving to stories.
Hi, everyone. Really glad to be with you today. So Carlton's talked about getting yourself to the place of theming, and now we're going to talk a little bit about moving to stories. And this is on page 5 of the workbook that you've got, theming workbook. So now what we're going to do is see how the themes that you have identified fit together. And there's 3 questions that we suggest you work with and stick with here. What's the story here? What is it that, what's going on? And how do these things fit together with the corollary, and where don't they seem to fit? So what you want to do is stick with these 3, use them again and again to help build a muscle here. These are the questions that will help you get to themes. There's going to be dissonance. It's a little bit like a jazz improv performance. You're going to, some things aren't going to feel right at times and so on and so forth, but like a jazz improv, it will come together. It's really important that you don't do this alone. You need team members to work with you on this. I have worked with communities, one community in particular, where they did try to do this alone and it broke down. And the CEO very quickly realized that and said, we're setting things aside and we're going to get in a room together and do this. So you'll do yourself a big favor by doing this together as a team. And just remember, don't try to get it right the first time. You know, work at it, experiment with different kinds of stories. moving to stories, here are some tips, and these are on page 5 of your workbook. Don't look for perfection. You want stories that will help clarify things and make sense of the world. There's no story that will explain everything. And it's really important to remember as you're doing this that the story of how people in the community see things may be different from how you see it. Play with the themes, try different ways of fitting them together, and you're going to find for sure that there will be some themes that don't fit. That's just fine. That always happens. Make sure you make a note of these, but don't get yourself stuck. And I think the other thing to say here is that we work with stories because stories are what people remember. And you guys will know that from your work in libraries and in life. And when you're creating the stories, what we used to call the Mad Lib and now call the community narrative, always start with the aspirations. Start there. That's where you're going to find the kind of positive, what the community wants. And here's the Mad Lib. I forgot to flip the slide. Just as a reminder, you're going to find things like people want, and it would be things like people want a safer, friendlier community, for example, and there'll be others like that. But they're concerned that there's too much transition in and out of town, so nobody knows their neighbors. As people talk more about those concerns, they talk about, they realize that they don't think that they have anything in common with new residents, and that new residents are a drain on the schools. They say that we need to focus on stronger English language efforts in the school and getting to know our neighbors. And if, in this case, churches and the local high school were to step forward, we'd be more likely to trust the effort and step forward to join them. It's just a quick example of the kinds of things that will come out of your community conversations. And some of you will already be discovering that as you do your community conversations. Okay, I'm going to pause for questions there, just before we move on to being a steward of public knowledge. Any questions? This will become much more meaningful, as Carlton said, once you have done some community conversations and sit down to try to make sense of them and to make meaning of them. So, no questions? Okay, I'm going to move along to the becoming a steward of public knowledge. Now, we did talk about this in the, wait 1 second here while I click that. We did talk about this in the lab when we were all together. Basically, a steward of public knowledge are both people and organizations that gather, share, and use the knowledge gained from community conversations so that the public knowledge contributes to the common good. So it's not your knowledge. That's the bottom line. It's what community folk have decided to share with you. So you'll see at the top of page 6, you'll see a few other definitions of stewardship, things like the careful and responsible management of something entrusted to one's care. That's a good one for this public knowledge, that the community has entrusted this with you. Or an ethic that embodies the responsible planning and management of resources. And we hear that a lot about stewardship of our environment and stewardship of our earth and those kinds of things. So stewardship carries with it an ethical responsibility, and it's linked to the principle of sustainability. And that is essentially what you are doing. You are becoming stewards of public knowledge. on behalf of your community. Just going to spend a couple of minutes on to reinforce this point. Stewardship is not ownership or control. It's very much you are custodian and you have an ethical responsibility associated with that. I want to say that people share very personal information with you in these conversations, and they have the expectation that you will use it to improve conditions in the community and to make a difference. And if you hold that thought, it will help you be a good steward of this knowledge. You do have a responsibility to protect people's privacy, but that doesn't mean you can withhold the public knowledge. It's not gained for the library's exclusive use. It's gained to help make a difference in the community. And this will be quite obvious to several of you, or all of you probably. Just a reminder, one of the responsibilities of being a steward of public knowledge is to follow up with participants. Too often folk go out into a community to quote unquote consult and don't get back to the community. So you want to make sure you do that, and you remember in the theming webinar there's a template and some suggestions, and sorry, in the community conversations webinar there's tips on how best to do that. You want to use public knowledge sensitively, and this is will become more obvious to you as you hold community conversations. You will learn things that, some things that you won't make part of your overall community narrative that you publish on your website or post in your reception or whatever. There'll be certain things that are learned that are better for particular audiences, and I'll use a community, an example here of a community where they learned that there was a lack of trust in the school board. And so in this case it was the United Way, and they had to decide what to do with that information. So they made a decision to go and share that with the school superintendent in a one-on-one meeting, and not to, because they felt that that was the place, the best shot at doing something with this in a constructive way. Be creative about your sharing. You know, I already mentioned post it in your reception area, you know, think about different kinds of media. Make sure you get it out there, but think about who your audience is, what level and type of detail they're going to need or that they would benefit from having. One example was going to the school superintendent. Another example, another community I worked in, they went to city councilors one at a time, and not all of them, and shared some of what they were learning for their particular riding or constituency, that kind of thing. And one other thing to note, don't sugarcoat, and this is all referenced in the guide in more detail. Don't sugarcoat what you're learning. If folk are upset about something, they are upset about something. So, you know, honor what they are telling you. Let me just pause and check, see if there are any questions at this point. Okay.
So there's one.
Okay.
Oh, there's one question,
Okay.
which is beyond the community narrative statement, what format do we recommend for knowledge sharing for various audiences?
That so depends on the audience. Some people, when they go to their advisory group or their board, they have a culture of using PowerPoints, and they will boards in particular, they will emphasize the themes that came out in the narrative and unpack that a little bit, and they will, and you'll see in a minute, about the considering when you present what kinds of questions you want people to think about and what kind of questions you want to work on together. So it varies a lot, but the prime vehicle is the Mad Lib. And then you will, again, if it's a one-on-one with a politician or with a school board superintendent or something like that, you'll make judgment calls about beyond the community narrative. What else, what other level of detail might the individual need and benefit from in the interest of the community? Actually, I don't know what's going on with my chat. Anyway, as long as you guys can see it, that's what counts. So let me just move on to the next slide. In a sense, I've already said this, but I will reiterate it now. Once you've themed and created your story, you want to think about and identify who to share the public knowledge with. An important thing to keep in mind here is, oh, Richard Frieder just said he doesn't see the question either. So anyway, let me back up. So having themed your community conversations, you are now ready to identify who to share the public knowledge with. And you want to always be thinking about sharing it in a way that creates meaning for others. And hence the value of the story. People remember stories, they will make the connections between aspirations, main concerns, etc. And one thing that you will learn, or may have this experience, is at first there can be a reluctance to share public knowledge. And so what we suggest people do is to start by, after they share it from within their organization, start sharing public knowledge with close or potential partners. This helps build trust and relationships, and it gives you more confidence in the sharing of public knowledge. It takes us back again to the value proposition: turn outward, make more intentional choices, and have a greater impact. And the sharing of public knowledge is a key turned outward behavior. So in being a steward of public knowledge, now we're going on to the practical, how do you do this? You know, who are the right people? How do you create the right space? And the piece around sharing meaning and applications. So you're going to be, I'm just going to flip us to the right people. Getting the right people. Start within your own organization and include decision makers. For some of you, your decision makers are part of the team, and for others, you have they are not part of the team, so you have an added important responsibility here. For all of you, your advisory group or board are not part of the team, so again, start within your organization and include decision makers. And then think about what partners might you share this with? Who are you working with, etc. But you do this after you are confident that your own organization understands the public knowledge and will use it. So let me just stay with your own organization for one more minute. The important thing, you want to share this across departments, functions, etc., your board, advisory group, etc. The important thing here is for them to be able to apply the public knowledge as they think about the implications. So there'll be implications for communication. There'll be implications for working with partners. There'll be implications for strategy, possibly implications for resource development, in addition to implications for programs. So that's the kind of thing that you will be thinking about inside your organization and helping people think about implications and what to do with this knowledge and what does it mean for our organization and particular functions within it. So once you have done this within your organization, then it's move it out and start by sharing with key partners, particularly those you trust and have a good relationship with. And that's particularly important if some of the information might be sensitive in the public space. And then we say move as quickly as you can to sharing the public knowledge broadly throughout the community. It's important to get it out there and to show that something's happening with the community conversations that you have done. And share it with informal as well as formal networks. And be strategic. This probably will come pretty naturally to you, but be strategic. Pick where you're going to share first, who with, why you're going to do that. And remember, you're learning about sharing at the same time as you are sharing. So be strategic in that sense as well. I'm going to pause here for see if there's any questions.
There is on a quick example of some public knowledge that we might share and with whom we might share it outside the library, just as an example.
Okay, so in some communities, many in fact, something like safety will come up. And I remember one community, there were several things that came up. Safety and crime was one of them. Another one was jobs and opportunities. And there were other things. And safety and crime were not at all under the bailiwick of the organization that we were working with. So they went to the chief of police and shared what they were learning about that with, it was a him in this case. So that's an example, Richard. That's a very specific example, and I hope that's helpful. They also, in that particular community, went to the Chamber of Commerce and other people who have their eye on jobs and the local economy and those kinds of things, where you would tailor the information. You'd share the overall Mad Lib and then spend more time on the opportunities, jobs, that kind of thing. Richard again. Would the library go to the chief of police without the community being part of a conversation? If I'm not sure what you mean. The library would definitely, the community has said something about crime and safety. They've said enough that it has become a main concern in your Mad Lib / community narrative. And you have, because you've done the more granular, detailed questions in the community conversation, you have more detail than just that it's a main concern. And so you would, yes, you, the library, would go to the chief of police and talk with him about him or her, about what you are learning. The community, you don't take the community itself, it gets too cumbersome, complicated. Remember, this is initially sharing public knowledge and helping it be meaningful to others in the community. Hopefully that's helped a little bit, Richard. Other questions? Richard Frieder again. Seems to you that it might raise the issue of trust between library and community. Richard, I don't understand why that would raise an issue of trust. Remember that you are honoring what they have already told you and several members of the community. So I'm not quite sure what you're saying. So let me just talk a little bit more while you're typing. What you're doing, you're going to the community, to the chief of police and telling him about what you're learning, about people's concerns about crime and safety. and some of the actions that they think could be taken. For example, more neighborhood police who work with the neighborhood association. I'm making this up now. Those kinds of things. So let me see what you said. You're not divulging anything that is. I don't understand. You are going to all of your partners, in a sense, without the community's knowledge, but you have made a commitment that you will do something with this. You have shared with everybody who's been in a community conversation. So they see what's come together from the multiple community conversations. And you have made a commitment that you will use this information in decision making and making a difference in the community. And that's what you are doing.
Let me provide, if I could, another example that I thought about as you were talking, Jan. There's a community, well, it's in Battle Creek, Michigan. They were doing conversations with a lot of different ethnic groups, and one of the things that they learned in those conversations that language barriers were causing some serious problems in the birthing centers of hospitals because the doctors didn't speak the language of the families and the women that were having children. And one of the things the group did as a result of that was they decided to meet with some people in the medical community. And the people in the medical community didn't realize that it was creating the extent of the problem in this Burmese population that it was. I mean, so that's just a case of thinking about, we've learned something, who else might need to know this that could do something about it?
Thanks, Carlton. That's a terrific example. Randall, when you share public knowledge, were you saying earlier that you should also suggest ways the knowledge can be applied? Can you give an example of a suggestion regarding? No, you do not suggest ways that knowledge can be applied at this point. What you are doing is sharing public knowledge, and I'm going to move on to the next slide now, and I think it'll help with this, Randall. Hang on just one sec. This is what you actually do in creating the space, and there are some, there's an agenda here as well, so it'll give you a better sense, and I hope to answer your question. So creating the right space is really important. It's got to be a safe space that's focused on learning and implications, not on process, activities, or to-dos. So this gets back to your question, Randall. You are not telling them what the implications are. You are asking. And so I'm going to just walk through the agenda and then talk a little bit more about implications. You can see from the roughly broken out agenda here that the meetings are usually something like 60 to 90-minute meetings. We explain the goals and ground rules at the outset, and they're the same ground rules as you use in community conversations. You share learning and its importance, and take about 20 minutes for that. Then you spend a big chunk of time on identifying implications, and we'll go on to some questions to use in a minute. And your last 15 minutes or so, you're going to determine takeaways. So if this is an hour and a half, a 90-minute agenda. If you've got 60 minutes, you will adjust accordingly. But you need a good chunk of time to share this. And it's really important to be disciplined about what you share and ask. And so the meeting facilitators got to keep the group focused. It's important to have someone who is respected. It will often be the head of the library or the CEO or the VP of community engagement or something like that. Somebody who's respected and will be listened to. And it's really the kiss of death if you let if the conversation goes into the details of the conversations, because then you get completely mired in the detail. You lose the sense of the community narrative, and you don't get to the talking about implications and determining takeaways. So I hope that's helping, Randall, as we go, and we can come back to you if it doesn't. So let me move on to the next slide. So this is just some real tips regarding shared meaning and implications. So here you want to share only the most important things that you have learned. And you are working on creating a wider circle of shared meaning with the folk that you are in the room with. And you get there by asking and working with these 4 questions. What do you make of what we are learning? Just a simple open-ended question. What are the implications for the work that each of us does in our community? So you're making it about the we in the room. It's not just about the library, it's about the work that they do as well. And where could we use what we are learning? And that's where you begin to get at ideas and possibilities and so on. And lastly, what possibilities are there for moving ahead? So again, you are working at creating shared meaning and understanding implications. Again, a similar cautionary note that we give you about innovation spaces: don't get caught up in planning or creating initiatives. Stay focused on these questions, because you're making meaning together and creating shared meaning. And the more people in the community and organizations in the community that have a similar sense of meaning of this, the more powerful you can become, or more powerful the community can become. Some cautionary notes. The questions are really well tested, and so we really recommend that you stay focused on them. You're not asking for agreement or opinions on what you heard. You're focusing on what's important about what people have said, and the key piece is what are the implications for our work and the work that each of us does in this community. The focus is the big picture, not on particular programs or initiatives, and on possibilities. And you may or may not recall in the lab, because there was a lot that went on in those 3 days, we talked about different boundary spanning roles that organizations can play in a community. Well, one of those was a connector role. And that is what you are doing as you share public knowledge and as you are a steward of public knowledge. You are playing a connector role between the community and other organizations that could benefit from this public knowledge. But just bringing us back to that boundary spanning organization connector role that we talked about there. I'm going to pause for questions again. Okay. Next slide. It's the moving to actions, and which is why we're doing all of this, right? It's important to identify the key takeaways that you can act on with the group that you're sharing the public knowledge. And there's 3 fairly straightforward questions here, and again, we suggest you really stick to these. Ask the group, who else needs to know what we're learning? Because they'll have some insight that you don't. They'll have connections in the community and so on and so forth that they can help you think about. How can we apply what we're learning to our work? And our work in this case is who's in the room. So it would be the library and I don't know whether it's a new immigrant organization or whoever some of your partners are. It's about our work And that could be, oh, that really relates to a particular aspect of our work in the new immigrant organization, and so we really need to think about that, et cetera, et cetera. Where can we best get started? So this is always a really important piece. You want to begin to think about and work with people that you've shared public knowledge, and then work in a way that begins to focus on where could we get started, what might we do, and it doesn't mean you have to do it together. Often that happens, sometimes it doesn't, but you'll frequently find that the community conversations and the community narrative resonate, and different pieces will resonate with different folk because of the work that they do in community. On the who else needs to know, be strategic here. Not everybody would have an interest, and you've got limited time and resources. Think about those who'd have an interest and who could get action underway. I already said resist the temptation to try and do everything at once. We all are very tempted to do that, but we very quickly get overwhelmed. And, ask, do we have ways for people to stay connected? If we're going to each go off and do different pieces of this, let's make sure that we know what's going on, et cetera. And make your first action. Really encourage folk to think about something short term, a quick win that doesn't need a lot of planning. And you've heard us talk many times about painting a school, or just having a potluck supper on a block, whatever that's very location specific and community specific, but try and do something that doesn't need a lot of planning, that begins to show some action and something happening in the community. Okay, I'm going to summarize and then see what questions, if any, this whole webinar has brought up. So, in summary, as Carlton said, you want to organize your notes from the individual conversations in the 6 categories, and then you want to combine them. Put them all together under the 6 categories. Your next step is to identify themes and create a story, a Mad Lib, a community narrative. And that will take some work, but it's very powerful once it's done. Just staying with something Carlton mentioned as well, that's where the 3 A's, the authority test comes into play. Could I stand on a table and tell the community, this is what I've heard, and that I understand you, and would they believe you? That's a really important, we call it the table test. And that's what you're doing there. And you will find this will become very real very fast, because if you are about to go out and share the story that has come from public knowledge, you will begin to feel it inside about, I'm not sure about that, or this, or whatever. I don't know if we had enough of this kind of folk in the room, et cetera, et cetera. All these kinds of things will start to come up. And eventually, you will come to a place of, I can stand on a table. I am comfortable going out and sharing this public knowledge. Share the story strategically, as we said, with others. Start inside your organization. And together move from learning to action by creating shared meaning and identifying implications. So 2 key parts. You're creating shared meaning and you're identifying implications with other folk in the room. I guess the final thing that I will say here, and then we'll do another big pause for questions, is we've worked with this process a lot in communities, so we'd really recommend that you use this process. It works. And you're developing a muscle in theming and sharing public knowledge. So it's always better to rely on something that has been proven. So we really encourage you to stay with this process. You're going to do, some organizations do many, many conversations. Others don't do many more than 10 to 15, but some cities have done 120 of these. And so this process will help you make sense out of multiple conversations. And lastly, just keep in mind that you are a steward in this process. You're a steward of public knowledge, and you have an ethical responsibility to the community members who participated and to the community to steward. Any questions before we move on to next steps?
But Jan, I don't have there's not a question, but I had something that occurred to me I might share with the group. And it's on this topic of something coming up in a conversation where you might go to the police that we were talking about earlier, because I actually had that occur when I was running the library in Youngstown. We were having community conversations in a part of the city that you might consider transitional. A lot of the people in this neighborhood were concerned that it was one of the last stable communities. They were seeing a lot of businesses close. They were starting to see vacant properties. There was a lot of concern about wanting to stabilize their community. And we were having these conversations, and 3 separate conversations, we kept hearing different stories about policemen that were sitting in cars while people down the street were being beaten up. And it wasn't the same story. It was different streets, and people didn't trust the cop in the neighborhood. But they did trust a newly elected mayor, and they did trust a newly appointed chief of police who had been visiting some of their neighborhood groups. And out of this conversation, what we ended up doing was some people simply went to these people they could trust in the police department. And they had to use some discernment about where do we start, because sometimes people don't trust the police. But it may not be all the police. So you might need to think a little bit about the context of what you're hearing, who needs to hear it, where maybe they have a shared aspiration that they want to see a community stabilized, as the mayor did and as this new police chief did. And that's where they started in sharing it, that knowledge with. But that was the real thing that happened, and the thing I would point out that is important there is understanding your context. Because quite often, I could go back to the medical community story, and it's where are you going to start with people that can make a difference? And there's almost a little bit of making an assessment. Are these people that I'm sharing with, do they really care about the community? And is that evidence in their words and actions? So there's a little bit of discernment going on.
Carlton, and something you just said about do they really care about the community? I think that's a great question to ask. And in some of the communities where I have worked in sharing public knowledge, the organization has learned that that some of the folks that they've worked with for a long time don't resonate, aren't interested, that kind of thing. So it's also a way of filtering out who won't make good ongoing partners, which is the reverse of what Carlton just said. That's a really good example. Thanks, Carlton. Okay, I'm going to flip us to next steps then. And that is just to remind you of the date for the next webinar, August the 20th, 2:30 Eastern Daylight Time. And that's about hosting and using innovation space. I know some of you have already launched on that, so we'll be looking forward to that. As Mary said early on, this webinar has been recorded and it will be posted. And lastly, Carlton and I have coaching calls. The group that I'm working with is on August the 6th, and Carlton's is on August the 7th. So we have been very efficient. Are there any other questions before we sign?
well. Thank you all.
Okay, thanks, Mary. Were you suggesting that the group hang here on their own? Was that the suggestion if they wanted to? Multiple attendees are typing. Okay, thanks, Mary. Just checking to see if there's a question coming up in chat. Looks like there so far thank yous. Our pleasure. Carlton's suggesting that we revisit the slides before the next coaching call and we can discuss them more. Thanks, Carlton. Thanks for that reminder. Because this was a lot. And if you haven't done a community conversation, it won't have as much meaning yet. Okay. Thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure, and look forward to the coaching call. And please bring your questions related to this to that call.